Let me kick things off. The first paper is going to be presented by Amandine and Julia. So the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your paper.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I'll start. Let me share my screen. Can you see it now? Can you all see my PowerPoint presentation? Okay, excellent. So it's a pleasure to present this joint work with Julia Rone, our postdoctoral fellow in the SovEU project. Our research is about conflicts of sovereignty and free trade agreements with a focus on CETA. And our starting point is what trade policy scholars have called the new politics of trade. As I'm sure you're aware, we've witnessed over the past few years the rise of public dissent about free trade agreements between the EU and other countries or other regions in the world. And this is not entirely new. We've had grassroots mobilization already from the late 90s onwards with the GATS and then ACTA and TISA, but really the more recent campaigns against the TTIP and the EU-Canada agreement have been really a climax of this contestation. And also the additional dimension to this joint campaign, TTIP-CETA, was really the assertion, the rise of the role of parliaments at all levels, regional, national, and also European. So really what we have now is a constellation of multi-level contentious politics over the EU trade policy. So what are the reasons for contestation? Increasingly, the trade agreements that EU has been negotiating with other trade partners have involved so-called deep trade issues. So it's not only about abolishing tariffs or even regulations in a more classical sense of the term, but really to go deep into regulatory cooperation and also investment matters, the liberalization of investment. And as many of you may be aware, the issue of dispute settlement between states and investors has been a particular focus of contestation. Interestingly for us, looking at the politics of trade, the European Parliament has acquired a new competence with the Lisbon Treaty to give its consent to free trade agreements. So this means also potentially to veto agreements. And instead of alleviating or preventing contestation and further involvement of other parliaments, this has rather fueled actually political debates over trade, making things even more interesting, so to speak. The literature gives us contrasted assessments of these recent developments. Some scholars on the one hand say, well, we've witnessed an important and welcome democratization of the EU policy, which has been an exclusive competence, which was rather opaque and diplomatic. And other scholars wrote that this could threaten the EU capacity to act as a global actor and have also interpreted mobilization as a more populist reaction about trade, perhaps exaggerating what was in the treaties and so on. What we want to do in this paper is reframe the debate through our framework about conflicts of sovereignty, because we think that it brings us much further in understanding what is at stake, but also the outcomes. Trade policy, I'll be very brief about that. We discussed it tomorrow, what we say in our paper. Trade policy really reflects those three more structural transformations in European politics through EU integration, but also a broader crisis of representation and the change of state-market relations over the past decades. So we raise here in the paper two research questions. First, what kinds of sovereignty conflicts over trade have manifested themselves? And two, how have those conflicts been settled so far? Do we see indeed a new trade order emerging. What we argue is that this is not about a vertical conflict between national sovereignty claims contesting the EU exclusive competence in trade. In contrast, it is, or not in contrast, but rather it is a horizontal conflict that we see emerging between two competing visions of sovereignty. One which is based on the prevailing executives which share sovereignty at the EU level, but have become increasingly autonomous vis-à-vis their constituencies in turn. And on the other hand, attempts to assert popular and parliamentary sovereignty, so related popular and parliamentary sovereignty in a multi-level fashion. So do we see a new constitutional settlement? We argue that not really. Politicization proves to be more occasional, more often than not. What we see is also a strategic fragmentation of trade policy as a kind of reaction of the EU, which overall pictures rather resilience of executive-based trade policy, which, by the way, tends to be supported by court decisions. So very quickly on empirics and methods, before handing over to Julia, we are trying to unpack multi-level contention, especially over the CETA, but we also look at what happens after CETA with a subsequent agreement between the EU and Japan. We gather sources on activism from the European Parliament, but also regional and federal parliaments in two federal states, one small, one large, where the conflict was particularly salient. So we have a number of sources about parliamentary activity. We also look at court decisions and civil society mobilization through the media, through activists, websites, etc. And I let Julia present you our findings from now on, and I'll stop sharing. Julia, you want to unmute your mic?
Unmute. Yes, do you see the presentation? Perfect, thank you. So what we did as empirical research was basically to trace the assertion of both the European Parliament and national parliaments across the EU. And what we found was that there was intense European Parliament activism on CETA, also following the activism on TTIP, actually. There were more than 227 questions on this agreement from 2014 to 2018. And this is actually substantially more compared to what happened with the subsequent agreement with Japan. What is especially interesting is that there was a really sharp and steep rise in questions about competencies and democratic participation. So there were a lot of MPs complaining that the parliament has not been involved in any of the decisions regarding the negotiations, that the negotiations were kept in secret, so there was no transparency, and that the voice of civil society was not heard. And in all these questions, what became very clear is that there was no opposition or competition between the European Parliament and national parliaments. On the contrary, members of the European Parliament insisted, for example, on clarifying whether CETA is a mixed agreement, several of them very normatively approving of this and thus empowering national parliaments, in fact. And also European members of parliament saw themselves as representatives also of popular mobilization as voiced by NGOs and other civil society organizations. So we really saw this very tense opposition between parliamentary and popular sovereignty on the one hand and the executives on the other hand. There was, of course, as Amandine already mentioned, massive civil society mobilization at the EU level, and this was a very conscious choice. Previous mobilizations against free trade agreements had very often chosen a global scale. In this case, all the organizations decided to make use of European legal instruments, such as, for example, the European Citizen Initiative, quite interesting, the European Commission rejected the European Citizen Initiative, claiming that it is not, does not fall within its competencies to initiate a legal act, according to the legislation about the ECI. That decision was later contested, but we can discuss this, the questions and answers. But the question is, there was really a trans-European civil society mobilization targeting the European Parliament. Then there was an instrument called the CETA check, which was again encouraging people to write to their parliamentarians. While there might not be a European demos, certainly civil society organizations tried to create a common front that pressures parliamentarians. And that did create a lot of pressure, and it had a very, very strong effect in the sense of several groups sympathetic to civil society grievances built a majority, or well, at least a vocal minority from within the parliament, and really questioned almost everything regarding that, especially the question of competencies. Last thing, and I will just mention this very briefly, and this is not also to Jan's presentation yesterday, a very important initiative was the TTIP and later CETA free zones initiative, which allowed cities to declare themselves CETA free. Some of them actually making explicitly arguments about local sovereignty, even though this might be considered problematic. Yes, and this European civil society mobilization targeting the European Parliament led some authors to talk of the rise of a new sovereigntism, which basically was driven by European left and more radical left and green actors, insisting that there is something distinctly unique about the European legal order that needs to be protected. Now, very quickly, and Chris, feel free to tell me when I need to finish. What is interesting is that the mobilization was not only at the
2 minutes, Julia.
Perfect, yeah. So there was very substantial mobilization at the national and regional level. And we looked at 2 cases, as Amandine mentioned, Belgium, which became famous with the so-called Volunian Rebellion. Basically, the parliament of the region of Walloon in Belgium threatened that it would not ratify CETA unless some conditions are met. One of the conditions was for Belgium to ask the European Court of Justice whether investor court systems and such type of settlements are compatible with EU law. There was also a requirement for a joint interpretative statement. Ultimately, after very tough negotiations, Wallonia agreed to sign the agreement, extracting some concessions that we argue were mainly symbolic. And that is the very, very interesting thing here. All right, moving to Germany, what actually Amandine found here, and I think that is super interesting, here the conflict was expressed not so much in parliamentary activity, but rather in challenges in front of the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany. So controversies around CETA were expressed in basically complaints in front of the Constitutional Court. Particularly interesting fact is that one of these complaints addressed the issue of dispute between supreme federal bodies, claiming that the Bundestag is guilty of not performing its constitutional obligation to participate in decisions over EU integration. And in fact, the Bundestag is awaiting the result of this decision before it ratifies CETA. In both cases, the cases of Belgium and Germany, again, and especially Belgium, I would say, parliamentary activity was very much considered as driven by civil society mobilization, and this could be found in many of the statements by parliamentarians. So again, we could see this front of parliament and civil society against executives, especially in the Belgian case. Yes, and finally, just one thing before I conclude. What we found particularly interesting is that contrary to many expectations back in the time of the Volunian Rebellion, trade policy in the EU did not become substantially democratized and did not change dramatically. So many were hailing CETA as a game changer. On the contrary, several key decisions of the ECJ stopped, or let's say contained this process. Very crucially, the ECJ decision with regard to the Singapore trade deal basically stated that agreements have to be mixed only if they include investment, for example, and several other small, not small, but other issues. Of course, this decision could have meant that all agreements from now on have to be mixed. However, the way the Commission interpreted this statement and acted on it was through splitting agreements. So from that moment on, the European Commission started splitting agreements into trade only and investment only, which basically led to very speedy negotiations and ratification of all agreements that followed CETA. So we had the agreement with Singapore, Vietnam, and Japan especially. And we looked into the agreement of Japan, which was much less salient. There was much less civil society mobilization, not only for the institutional issue that we discussed, but also for other issues related to civil society mobilization logic. In general, there was no big change. And so conclusions, very quickly, Chris, sorry. So the contestation over CETA reflected a deepening conflict between two conflicting visions of sovereignty. And these were not national and supranational. On the contrary, we had the idea of sovereignty of people, or peoples represented by parliaments, seeking to assert themselves, both at the national and at the European level. And then the other vision, the one that we think prevailed so far, was the state sovereignty of the executive, sharing sovereignty with their EU partners, but having gained autonomy vis-à-vis their constituents. And finally, yes, this is our main conclusion. CETA turned out to be a game changer, only insofar as it brought a new strategy splitting trade agreements. But unfortunately, it did not bring the so desired democratization of trade. Again, we expect that politicization will continue, so it's still an open question, but so far it seems executives have won and have their ground. Thank you very much, and sorry for going over time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Amandine. Thank you very much, Julia.